What is up, guys? Welcome back. If you're new, my name is Charles, owner of mXrevival and mXrevival.com, and today we're going to be fixing these blown and leaky fork seals on my buddy Danny's AER48 forks. So today I'll be showing you guys how to do this yourselves. It's actually very easy once you get a few practice runs in. So by the end of this video, you'll know how to change fork seals on just about any fork, and you'll also have a great overview of all the tools you'll need to do the job. And in addition to the fork seals and dust seals, we're also going to change a few common wear items inside the forks. And like I said, you should be able to tackle just about any fork seal after this job, and even if you have an inverted fork that is similar to this but built just a little bit differently, maybe it comes apart a little bit differently, the procedure is actually just the same thing. Main differences will usually just be oil height or capacity, maybe how you fill the oil, little things like that, but that's all also found in your owner's manual. As for these AER48s, you will find these on all modern full-size KTM, gas, and Husqvarnas starting in 2017. There are also a few sets of these on the 2016.5 factory edition bikes. Those bikes are the ones that come out with pre-production stuff at the half-year mark. So if you guys own a 2016.5 through 2023 KTM, Husky, or more recently gas, then this procedure will apply specifically to you and your bike. Real quick, I want to give a little bit of history on this fork. I've actually owned a couple different pairs of them and I really like them. If you want to get straight to the job at hand, you guys can use the chapters in the description below. Skip forward, skip back, whatever you need. Otherwise, here's a little bit of AER history and some of my personal experiences with this fork. So like I said, these came out in 2016 on factory editions and went into production in 2017. I actually owned a 2017 KTM 250 SX 2-stroke and a KTM 350 SXF 4-stroke. They were really awesome to have side by side. They're pretty much identical. Frames, bar position, pegs, everything except for obviously the engine. And of course the 350 doesn't let you get lazy. You have to keep your two-stroke skills up on that thing, keep it revved out all the time. They were a really excellent cross-platform to jump back and forth from. So anyways, they both came with an earlier version of this Xact fork. And to be brutally honest with you guys, I absolutely love them even though they are an air fork. There's no other air fork like this and these things work phenomenally. There's definitely a bit of setup and adjustment curve in the beginning with these forks, especially if you're coming from a coil spring unit. Ultimately, I did end up dialing them in perfectly for my riding ability and skill level. One of the main reasons these forks differ from a coil spring fork, at least to me, is they offer a little bit less feedback typically. So sometimes there feels to be this lack of connectivity between, let's say, your bars and the ground, your front tire. With a coil spring fork, you're essentially connected all the way through from your bars all the way to the ground. There's physically a piece of metal, aka the spring, that is actually connected from the top of your fork to the bottom of your fork, and that really does something for the feel, at least in my opinion and experience. And basically that translates to the bike talking to you more. You feel more of what's happening. And so when you're getting used to the air fork, it can feel a little bit vague. Another thing I noticed with mine is they always seem to want to be fully extended, like the air pressure was holding the forks outward or apart. Sometimes in sand, that would make the front wheel push sand out of the way, feel a little swirly. And on the spring fork, it would naturally sort of compress under your weight just a little bit, and that helped it hook up a little bit better. You didn't have to break through the crust as much, let's say. But once you start pushing the AER, it really likes to be abused. It can handle just about anything. You can case big jumps, but it's also still really supple over chop. You just have to start pushing past that crust. That explanation is tied, of course, to the 2017 units I've had, and recently I've sat on some newer versions of these forks on the bike, and the crust, you can feel it break right when you sit on it. They feel incredibly like coil spring forks. It's kind of wild how much they've innovated these. Currently I'm back on Suzuki's and those have coil spring forks, so no real complaints. You can't argue with millions of dollars of Japanese R&D. Coil springs just work. We're all familiar with them. There are great settings available for them, and aside from being about 3+ pounds heavier than the AER air fork, which is a huge benefit to those, you can't really go wrong with a coil spring. But if you're sick of your air fork, your AER specifically, there are tons of really great kits out there. MX Tech makes an open bath style dual spring, dual cartridge kit. They even have hydraulically actuated bump stops at the bottom when you bottom out. Really tech stuff from Jeremy. Pro Circuit also has a single spring kit, I'm almost positive. And that one replaces the air chamber with a long single spring rather than a dual spring. So on one end you have your valving side still like normal, and the other side gets swapped out with a big long spring. And some people say the harmonics of a single spring versus a dual spring is better. I don't actually know. I've never owned a single spring fork, at least not with an actual coil in it. Air is technically a spring. Then companies like Technical Touch even offer a Yamaha SSS solution for these forks, where they take the Yamaha parts and drop those right into these KTM forks. I'm sure those ride like a dream. And one of my favorite setups that I did actually use was a sub valve from Ride JBI. JBI created a sub valve that controls the oil flow immediately rather than a little bit after suspension action, and this effectively allowed me to lower the PSI, which lets those forks or the crust I mentioned earlier sort of break sooner, lets the bike get down into ruts better, but it also still doesn't bottom out due to the lack of the extra air pressure because the oil is controlled sooner. That was a really great product and it was very inexpensive. That was also paired with JBI's MX spec valving. I'll leave a link for that down below in the description for you guys. And another quick tip, if you guys own KTMs or Huskies with the dreaded 4CS fork, you can actually swap these AERs onto your bike. I've had a couple different customers I've done this for, both of which were so fed up with their bikes they were going to sell it before we did the AER conversion. One caveat to that swap is that you're going to want to use the AER clamps if you do that fork swap, because the 4CS have a bigger tube diameter in the top clamp. So if you weasel your new AERs up into those 4CS clamps, it's not going to be able to bite them properly up top. You may be able to get away with an upper triple clamp only for that swap. You're just going to want to make sure that the offset is still 22 millimeter, as I believe it was on all the AER equipped triple clamps. If you do end up with the 2017 and up triple clamps to go with your AERs, you're also going to get the tapped and threaded upper clamp, which will allow the direct bolt-on of a KTM hour meter. That was something that started to come standard in 17 and probably also on the 16.5 models. And if you really want some trick shit, guys, I have a pair of triple clamps down below, some Luxon splitties. They are in the description. You have to check those out on my site. They're unbelievable. The split clamp design around the tube actually lets the forks go through easier with less binding because the forks aren't always perfectly straight. They sort of arc in and out of one another, believe it or not. So if you want some super trick clamps with a bunch of titanium hardware and a bung for a steering damper, you absolutely have to check those out. So that pretty much wraps up my little history lesson for whatever it was worth. So let's go ahead and jump into this job. We're going to check out how it's done. I'm going to show you guys the parts you need for replacement and of course all the tools to get it done as well. So let's strap on the GoPro so I can show you what I'm doing, and I hope you enjoy it. All right guys, it's time to get to work. I don't know if you can tell, but I cleaned the shop out. I got rid of like 3-4 bikes, I think, 10 of those full-size bins. So much more room for activities. It feels great in here. So why don't you say we get this fork job done? Let's go ahead and take a look at all the tools you're gonna need first, and if anything pops up that I'm missing so far, of course I will grab it and explain it as the video goes on. So of course we have our forks, our leaky subjects, and here are a few of the other things we're going to want. Of course, something to catch oil. There's going to be a lot of oil. For that reason, I also have a sheet of FRP on the wall and a rug down below. This can be quite dirty, so put some things up to protect from oil splash. It's going to happen. And then you're going to want all the parts we're going to be trading out and the oils. So we have some KTM guide bushings here. These are the bushings that allow the tubes to slide in and out of one another, keep some kind of alignment, and they are a wear part, so these have about 20 hours on them. It's time. I've seen them go in less time than that. And we got some SKF fork seal and dust seal kits. One is for oil and one is the outer one you see, aka the dust seal. So you're going to want 2 packs of those. The orange seals that are on your KTM stock, they are also SKF. These are amazing. Spend a few extra bucks and get a fork seal that is going to last longer and work better. I'll show you guys in a little bit the difference. Well, I guess I can't show you the difference per se, but I'll show you how little stiction these have, and then I'll explain how the other, off-brand ones would be in comparison. We've also got our oil. I need to get a measuring cup. I don't have that out yet. Let's see. Boom, there it is right there. Ratio right always does the trick because these measure in cc's, which is usually how the manual describes the oil capacity. And so aside from the bushings, the seals, and the oil, we don't really need any other parts that are gonna go into these forks. So moving on to the main tools to do the job, there are a few special tools you need to do this. You're going to need a fork cap wrench. KTM uses a 6-sided wrench. Most other brands use an 8-sided wrench, so that's KTM specific. And depending on whether you have an Xplor fork or the old bladder type fork KTM or the AERs that we have here, which are now called Xact, pretty much every single type has a different special cap wrench if it's a KTM. Like literally every single KTM fork has a different cap wrench. We're going to need a seal bullet, which you actually don't need this if you don't want to buy one, but they're only about $4 and they help you slide the seal on to the lower tube without damaging it straight away, and you'll see that in use in a little bit. I'll give you an alternative trick to that guy when we get to that point. If for some reason I blow it, let me know in the comments and I'll let you know. I'll pin that comment if I do screw up. Then of course we need a seal driver. This sucker is going to go around the lower tube and it's going to bang the fork seal into its final resting place until of course it leaks again. On that note, guys, I have had fork seals go over 80 hours. If you take care of your forks between washes and you keep the dirt and contaminants off the tubes, they will last a really long time. Let's see if I can give you a quick tip to make your fork seals last way longer than your favorite suspension tuner would recommend. I don't know if you guys can see that, but we have some calcium deposits on the fork tubes here from washing the bike. One way to make your fork seals last way too long is to finish drying your bike all the way. When you're done washing it, you want to get rid of all these little calcium deposits. And when you're done with that, usually there's a little bit of leftover oil from one of these. Go ahead and oil up a rag and you wipe your forks down with some of that extra oil. That will condition the seal, will condition the tube, because over time, believe it or not, this calcium does take its toll on the fork seal and it does tend to rip it up. So that could actually cause a leaky fork seal over time. And like I said, I've had fork seals last over 80 hours. Other than that, guys, we have a few basic tools. We've got a ratchet, 19mm socket. This would be in lieu of an axle. I don't have Danny's axle. I'll show you why I'm going to use this extension in a little bit. And then for the KTM specifically, we have a T20 Torx bit. This is going to be to remove the clickers for compression and rebound, just so we don't break them while we're doing this job. And last up, I'll be able to track Danny's settings in case he loves where his clickers are at now. I'll be able to document that as I take the forks apart, and this will be a guide for me to put them back to where they were, and also something for him to look out on the track or trail. So let's go ahead and get started. These forks do need a little tiny bit of cleaning. Danny did a really good job, but there's always something left behind. So step one, we're gonna go ahead and get these fork guards off. We're gonna take these outside. I'm gonna hit them with some Dawn dish soap and make sure every speck of dirt and grime is 100% off of these before I crack them open. That's very important. These are just a basic 8mm. And this appears to be the leaky bastard of the two. As you can see, we had some debris fall off here, so we want to get rid of all that stuff. That is some very Idaho-esque sand. All right, so let's go ahead and get all the dirt off of this bad boy. Notice the microfiber towel. I'm going to be flipping this thing on its end, and I do not want to scratch it at any point. We've got a little bit of dirt stuck in here, so we'll use this dorky little pink screwdriver to get that stuff out. A little bit of soap. This is turning you guys on. Once we dry this thing off, she'll be good to crack open. Okay, it's time. We will start with the damping leg first. And when I say damping leg, I say that because the other side has an air spring in it, or an air cartridge. So you can see the tops are a little bit different. There is not oil in this center cartridge here because it's an air spring. However, all the valving and main damping duties are handled by this cartridge and this fork. So there's oil in each outer tube and there's oil in this center cartridge, but not in the center cartridge on the air side. So the procedure is a little bit different for both. The air side is definitely easier. We'll start with the harder one first. And so the first thing we're gonna wanna do is back out the clickers, compression and rebound on the other end. You always document this from the closed position. You may have heard 12 clicks out, 13 clicks out. So we're gonna count the clicks in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It was 13, 14, yep, 14. So 14 out. Like I said earlier, this is going to help me remember where to put these back to, because we're gonna back them out all the way. So compression was 14. And then we can do the rebound next. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I spun those in to find out effectively how many clicks they were out before I spun them in, if that makes sense. So rebound 14, compression's 14. Set that aside because it will get covered in oil. Now we can spin these all the way back out like we're supposed to. And then gently we'll take that T20 Torx and remove that clicker, because we don't want to break it while we're working on this. We'll do the same thing on the rebound end here. With those out of the way, we can go ahead and get the cap busted loose. We have our cap wrench, again 6-sided, specific to the KTM. This is another reason at this point why it's nice to have clean tubes, because if you have oil on the tube, it's really hard to get the caps off, like really hard. That one came loose pretty easily when they're new. That is typically the case. After they've been worked on a few times, sometimes it's not that easy. And actually, I missed a trick. Guys, if I would have bled this first with this bleeder screw, that does relieve some pressure and it does make it easier to get the cap off. So go ahead and bleed yours first next time. Don't be an idiot like me. If you guys are still having a hard time getting the cap off after you've bled the fork and all that, you can go ahead and stick your fork back into your triple clamp just high enough so that you can get the cap wrench back on, and the bike actually acts like a second set of hands. So if it's really hard, you can throw it back in your clamp. At this point, you can go ahead and open your cap all the way, and you can drain the oil that is housed in this outer tube. Take your time with this step. There's a lot of oil in there, and so you can pump the tubes back and forth. Even if this takes 5 minutes, the more oil you can get out now, the less mess you're gonna have on your hands as you continue forward with this job. At this point, we've got most of the oil out. We're down to a slow drip. I like to take this and screw the cap back on just down to the O-ring. This will help contain some more of the mess while we bust the fork, or the dust seal, loose, I should say, which is our next step. As mentioned, if I was missing a tool on the bench, I was going to let you know you will need a small flathead screwdriver. It really helps pry the dust seal off. So having said that, with our oil drained and our cap back on loosely, we can go ahead and wedge the tip of this screwdriver gently, because you don't want to slip and nick the tubes, even though they are really tough. You're going to stick this guy between the dust seal and the upper tube and gently pry the dust seal out. You guys can see it starting to come out. You just work your way around until it comes all the way out. You don't need to force it. It comes out really easily, and there you have it. And so behind the dust seal here, there's actually a circlip holding the fork seal up inside the upper tube. We'll go ahead and use the same screwdriver to get that out. I'll give you guys a closer look at this thing when it comes out. I know it's difficult to see on the GoPro. I had to jump down to a smaller screwdriver. Pinky's back on the grind. You can gently lift the clip out, and just once the end of it pops up, you can start to gently work it, and as you can see, it just flew out. Next thing we're going to want to do is to undo this nut here in the bottom of the fork lug. This cartridge inside, from the top cap all the way down to the fork lug, sort of tie the entire piece together. And so now we're going to use this extension, and remember earlier I told you this would be in lieu of an axle. If you have your axle, you can stick it into the fork lug here, and when you go ahead and rotate this nut out of the bottom, it's going to keep the fork leg from spinning. So guys, you're going to flame me. I'm using a 7/8 standard socket for this. I don't know where my metric stuff went, but you'll survive. Be nice to me. As you can see, the fork did not spin or rotate, so this little axle trick is super handy. And as you spin this out, you'll hear it start to click when you run out of threads. Let's see if it does it. Yeah, this one's not making like an audible click like I thought it would, but it's all the way out. So go ahead and just pull that out and set it aside. It's not dirty. It tells me a lot of dirt did not make it into these forks, which is great. So set it aside on a clean rag. And so once I take this top cap off here now, I'll be able to pull the entire cartridge out of this bad boy. And what's kind of cool is we're not going to have a coil spring come flying out at us. That is one perk of air forks. Weight savings and a little bit less componentry to deal with. There you have it. So now you can see a little better what I was talking about, the difference between this fork leg and the air fork leg. You had the oil we drained in the outer tube, and then this guy here is filled with more oil. This is actually what handles all the bumps and abuse, this damping rod. So we'll go ahead and replace all the fork seals and bushings first, and then we will go ahead and jump into this guy. This is going to need an oil refresh as well. And all throughout this job, I'm constantly cleaning my hands, wiping things up. We've got blue rags, we've got brake clean. I always have a stack of these pre-peeled and ready to go, about 10 of them, and I always blow through all of them and have to peel off another stack. Got a huge oil mess over here already. Just like to clean things up as I go. You're going to have a little bit more oil to drain now too. So with this removed and the nut removed in the bottom of the lower lug, we can actually pull these apart now, and this is how you're going to get access to the fork seals. You're going to pull these apart, and bang them and clang them until this thing just separates. Like so. I like to set the upper tube aside while I'm dealing with the seals and the bushings, just let it kind of drain out a little bit. Now we can take a look at all these parts inside. So these are the bushings we're replacing. One of them is the upper guide bushing. Just open it with your fingers. It's not completely smoked, but we're here, so we're going to go ahead and replace them. There's the lower guide bushing. Also looks pretty good inside. Then there's always a washer in here, followed by the fork seal itself. These are the parts that leak. Then you have the little circlip, and finally the dust seal itself. Now at this point, if you want, you can also remove these rings. These tell you your fork action travel. So if you're messing with your settings and you go out and try something, you can see how far down your stroke was. So that's pretty convenient. Most guys just leave them on. I'll do the same. So now we can actually go ahead and start to replace all those parts we just pulled out, the bushings and the seals. And now we're also going to go ahead and use the seal bullet. This guy goes right on top of this tube here. You can see There are some sharp edges, and sometimes you'll kill the seal before you ever even get out to go and ride. You just drop this on here, it flushes up with one of these sharp ridges here, and as the seal goes on, it can't really be scathed by those sharp edges. At this point, I also like to take the cap from one of these oil bottles and fill it with a little bit of fork oil. And I will use this to rub on the seals and parts as I start to put them back onto the lower tube. A little bit of oil inside the dust seal, that's the first part. Drops on easily. You guys remember the circlip that holds the fork seal into the tube? We give that a little bit of a wipe down sometimes because these are raw steel. They become extremely rusty. So in some cases, if you guys have KTMs, you will need to replace this. I cannot for the life of me remember the name of the company that came out with some of these that are either plated or a different material, but you could actually zinc plate them. I'll leave a link to a zinc plating video down below for you guys. Anyways, you're going to want to put that on. And I should also mention that in a lot of cases when you're dealing with these circlips, you want to make sure the sharp side is pointed down. These always happen to be really sharp on both sides, so no big deal there. And you're going to go ahead and go for the fork seal, oil that up, and you'll notice that one side is hollow, one side is not. The hollow side always points up towards your triple clamps. That's what's holding all the oil into the fork. Go ahead and slide that over your fork bullet. Easy money. Then you can go ahead and take the bullet off the tube. At this point, you're going to wipe down that washer, that one that was installed that you took off a minute ago. Slide it back on. That always goes on top of the fork seal. Oil up your first guide bushing. It's the larger of the two that can actually slide down to the same level as everything else. Then your last guide bushing, oil that up. This one's going to lock itself into that groove on the top of the tube. And that's it, guys. That is basically a fork seal job and a bushing job. Pretty straightforward. And as I said in the intro to this video, they all look exactly like this. They might come apart the same. They might not have the same nut in the bottom, all that sort of thing. But all the fork seals, if the forks are inverted, this is exactly the same. And just to give you a quick order so you can commit it to memory, you have your dust seal, then you have your circlip, your fork seal, your washer, your larger guide bushing, and your smaller guide bushing, and that is the order. So next we're going to want to prep and clean this upper tube. You can use brake clean, you can use contact cleaner. There isn't really anything looking inside of this tube that's super dirty. This bike is pretty much brand new. I do like to take a rag, clean out the end here. A lot of debris can pile up here, especially if you have a breached seal, the oil will pull in dirt. I like to run my finger into that circlip groove, my fingernail, and then if you don't have a spray, you can take that rag, stick it in there like so, and then just use the damping leg to push the rag all the way through the tube, and that does a really good job of cleaning any debris out as well most of the time, especially on tubes that are as clean as Danny's are. But preferably you would want to go ahead and clean these out somehow. Burned up my rag stack. It's funny, you know, these rolls keep getting smaller, and so do the actual size of the towels themselves. Those guys think they're slick, but I'm totally onto it. Anyways, now that you guys are done cleaning your outer tube, it's good and ready to go. Next step, actually go ahead and start putting everything back together. Now, it's very important. You guys may have noticed that I used KTM OEM bushings. Very important to use these, or use maybe a Pro X. Other brands are okay, but they seem to increase drag, and I've even had some of these bushings be too large for the application they were listed for and not properly go back into the tube, or go into the tube so tight that they weren't able to be used. But always KTM OEM, or OEM for your specific bike, or Pro X, you really can't beat it. So we can go ahead again, drop this lower into the upper, and you get to the point where you have the fork seal here. It's time to use the fork seal driver. We're going to go ahead and seat this fork seal into this tube, and then it's going to get locked back into place with the circlip. So what you want to do is take your seal driver, this guy here, put half here, put the other half on the other side, and then go ahead and send that bad boy home. And you can pretty much tell, you can hear and feel when it's bottomed out. 2 hits was good enough, and you can double check by looking inside, and you'll actually be able to see the groove where the circlip lives, and that'll tell you you are good to go to drop that circlip back in. And so earlier I told you guys I was going to show you why SKF seals were the best due to the stiction. Check this out, just drops. It doesn't hold itself up in the air. Some seals, you let go of the fork leg and the tubes will just stay right where they're at. And so you're getting this extra drag on your forks that you don't want. These SKFs last a really long time. They're a little more expensive, but they are amazing. Like, you can actually feel the difference riding. So now we can go ahead and get this circlip, this little guy here, back into his groove. Just go ahead and work it back in there. It will compress, and then you can push it the rest of the way back in with a screwdriver. You're gonna wanna work from one end to the other, and when it's all the way in, you're gonna hear it click just like that. Visually double check, look inside there, make sure it's seated. I have seen these come out on the track. It's ugly, makes a big mess, and then you have to rebuild everything all over again, or at least take it apart, fill it back with oil. Just a big pain in the butt. And so now with everything in place on the inside, we just have the dust seal left to put into the upper tube, and you can gently push this in with your fingers all the way around, or you can just do this. And it's completely set now, so dig that a lot. So now that this tube is reassembled with the bushings and the seals, we can go ahead and set it aside. We're gonna go ahead and change the oil inside the damping cartridge here. And this is going to require two of the tools we have out. One of them, of course, being that 6-sided wrench I showed you earlier. Of course, it's soaked in oil and stuck to the table because this is just a messy job. And the other tool is that special AER48 cap wrench for the center cartridge here. Now this is just gonna drop right into the top here, and this is why we take those adjusters out, those little plastic ones. This one actually fit in over it just fine, but the old school ones that had like a triangle shape or a 3-prong instead of the 2-prong I removed, it would hit the triangle one. So as you can see, KTM's got their super fancy little procedure to get this out. So now we're gonna go ahead and take the cap tool and use it much like that axle trick I showed you earlier where we used the extension. And we're gonna drop this guy in here, and we're gonna use the cap wrench here just to push down against so that the tube isn't just spinning, and this will really help us get this off much easier. There we go. Once it's broken free, you can do this part by hand. Now it's going to get to a point where it stops spinning, then you can just sort of push in on the rod and it will pop out eventually. There we go, got it to rise out. And there's of course going to be a bunch of oil in here, so slowly let it drain, slowly pull this top cap out, give it a wiggle if you have to, and eventually it's going to dislodge, so be ready for the oil flow of that. There we go. Of course this oil is beautiful, it's perfect, it's nice and clean. You can usually take this a lot longer than the outer tubes, but we're in here, so we're gonna do it right. I'll be pulling this rod in and out. It's gonna release a ton of fluid out of the cartridge, so do it slowly, otherwise it will shoot like quite literally every single place it possibly could. Just take your time with it, work it in and out. And eventually, that's what you'll end up with. So at this point, you get a chance to inspect everything. You can kind of look at the O-rings, see if they're getting cut or damaged, see if there's anything you need to replace. One up top, a couple below, you got these plastic bands. You got the shim stack in there. I know it's difficult to see in ultra high clarity on a GoPro, but this is where one of the stacks are on each side of this piston. Pretty cool, this stuff's really fascinating. And so now that we know everything looks okay, we can go ahead and fill this back up with oil. We're gonna start by extending this rod all the way. And I don't know the oil capacity of this, but that's okay. We're gonna fill it up to a certain point, do a little bleed procedure. So you wanna put your finger over this hole here, otherwise it will leak out and past. And you're just gonna fill the tube up, keep an eye on it, get the fluid up to about where that thumb hole is. Start pulling this slowly. It's gonna start taking in oil up top. We're gonna keep filling it until it keeps raising back up to about that thumb hole. If you pull this fast, again, you're gonna shoot oil just all over the place. You'll start to feel resistance again against the oil. And there you just heard some air. We're gonna go ahead and drag it back out and keep filling it up. And you guys can't see it, but it almost looks empty again. Fill her up. So almost this entire bottle of oil is already gone. It's 1 liter. We'll go ahead and depress this again. Slowly pull it back out. Slowly. This stuff will literally shoot up all over the ceiling. And you want to do that a few more times back and forth until you don't get any sort of slip from this rod. You'll feel it, like I said, against the oil as you go in and out. You'll feel the resistance. And then we are going to take a screwdriver once this rod is fully extended and just sort of give everything a little tap. If there's any air bubbles anywhere, we want to get those out. We want to get all the air out of this leg. That's the whole point of this step. Give it a few more ins and outs. You guys can see the oil level is still really high. That's exactly what I want right now. We're gonna go ahead now and put the top cap back in. I still have my finger over that hole in the side of the tube to keep oil in. This cap is going to get to a point where it's not going to want to go back in any further because the pressure buildup. And so I'll let my finger off that hole. I'll let a little bit of oil out, and I'll just keep working this in until it gets back into its home. You guys can see that hole there. I pulled my finger off of it. You can see oil working its way out. You want to shroud that with your hand because it just shoots all over the place. I've moved the oil pan to the floor, as you can obviously see. As I push this cap in, you can see the oil flowing out of that hole. You're going to get to a point where you cannot get the cap any further in. You can go ahead, depress the rod. It's going to shoot oil out from that hole. It's going to allow you to get the cap to go further back into the tube once that oil is displaced. And once you've displaced enough oil, you're going to be able to get the cap to go all the way back in and thread it. And so you could see why knowing the oil capacity ahead of time would save you the hassle of going back and forth with that. But at any rate, you know you can still get it done if you don't. And the way you know it's fully bled is if this rod comes back out all the way to full extension, which it has, and there are no air bubbles in it. So press it all the way down, comes all the way back out. That is solid. So this thing's ready to reinstall. Before we go ahead and reassemble everything, we're going to take the rebound adjuster, just give it a quick hit with the brake clean, make sure all the old oil is off of it. It's got kind of a yellow hue to it. Doesn't really look that clean. Get it nice and clean before you reinstall it. Then we can go ahead and take the fork tube, put this assembly back into it, the rod. You'll notice that this is hexed at the bottom, so this is going to drop into the fork lug, and that's very important. So when I get down there, I'm going to spin this until it drops into place right there. Then we can go ahead and put that nut back in. Once again with the axle trick, I'm going to tighten this up. Doesn't need to be crazy. Just give it a nice snug. There we go. And so now this thing is sealed on the bottom. We're actually able to pour oil back into the outer chamber. If I'd like to leave the tubes open, lean this up against something. This oil height for this fork, according to Racetech's website, which you guys can check for all your oil heights and whatnot, spring rates, new spring rates, is calling for 280 cc's. So we got the ratio right out. We got it all clean. Make sure there isn't any oil in there from something else. Got that up to 280. And we're just going to go ahead and pour this in against the cartridge in the center, and it kind of guides it in. And that's it, guys. You can screw the top back on. All that's left to do on this guy now is reinstall the little plastic clicker adjusters, give it another bath out there with the Dawn dish soap, and this one's ready to be put back into service. I want to make sure these tubes go back to Danny nice and clean, spileless. These have to go into his truck, so the last thing we want to do is get residual fork oil all over that beautiful Cummins he's got. All right, it's time to get down on fork leg number 2, but I'm not going to show you how to do the fork seals and the bushings because you guys are already pros. I don't see the point in being redundant because boring videos suck. But I do want to show you the air cartridge, or basically what is the spring in this suspension setup. I think it's pretty cool and it's worth taking a look at. At this point, it's crucial to make sure all the tools and your gloves and everything are clean of oil, because you guys might remember from fork leg number 1, if we get oil on the tubes and on our hands, it's going to be one hell of a fight getting this cap off. And so you could always go back to the triple clamp trick we talked about earlier too. So wish me luck, and may the moto gods grant me the strength to bust a cap. Oh yeah. Again, I forgot to bleed the fork. You heard all that pressure come out. What an idiot. Same thing, just drain it. We'll go ahead and do the axle trick again. Socket on this side is a little smaller. It's a 19mm instead of the larger type. Out comes a cool little blue anodized cap. There we go. There is the spring. Doesn't look like the spring you're used to, right? So this thing's full of air. Cannot compress it. It is probably about 150 psi, somewhere in that range. And this design is actually brilliant. Check this out, guys. So obviously it's just one canister of air, right? So how the hell does that work? There's a little notch in here, or a little divot or dimple you can see. And when this rod gets past a certain point, it lets the air that's being charged or compressed on one side as a spring bleed over to the other side. And it uses the same air both for compression and rebound. So really interesting, really cool. It weighs nearly nothing. And that's why these forks are like almost 4 pounds lighter than a typical spring fork. So lots of really cool benefits of running this, and this is the stock stuff on KTM's.
It's come so far since it came out in 2016 and a half, 2017 production. And this is like a trade that I could totally get into. Suspension tuning, it's really interesting. I don't know much about it at all. Definitely not a pro by any means, but I just find some of this stuff super intriguing. It seems like there's always a new type of fork coming out. RIP to the ones that didn't make it, like the Show Attack fork, which had 3 air chambers. Of course, nobody wants to deal with that crap. And one other interesting thing about these for you guys that have forks that are not operating properly, if this seal inside, I believe it's still called a quad ring seal, which is sealing the air from one side or the other, used to be a 3-lip. I believe they upgraded it to a 4-lip early on because they were having cold weather failures on the 3-lip design. Anyways, if that seal goes bad, then basically the chamber will equalize. It will let air to one side of the seal that it shouldn't be on at that time, and so this sort of gets stuck like in the middle. It won't really work well in either direction. So if your bike is sagging in the front, something's wrong. It's probably this quad ring seal. So at that point, you'd want to take this to a professional tuner if you are not one yourself, to have this all deconstructed and have that lip serviced and repaired. So guys, now it is time for me to get into this whole bushing and seal situation again. It's my last step on this process. Like I said, I'm not going to bore you to death with this, so let's go ahead, wrap up this video. I really appreciate you watching. I hope it's been helpful, and I'll be done with this in about 10 minutes. Not so fast. I got one thing left to do. Guys, you remember the oil height was 280 cc's. Our boy DR, Mr. Danny Rocha. Spring rate, we're gonna leave that blank. That is his personal preference. That is the air spring. Stock calls for, let's see, on the 450, 10.7 bar. I don't know what that is in PSI. Those tricky Europeans, I tell you. All of our clicker adjusters are back on, both rebound and compression. And with that said, this fork job is 100% complete, ready to shred again. And there we go, looking fresh.
All right, guys, that wraps it up. Another fork seal job well done. All I need to do now is get these forks back to Danny and try and convince him to actually go riding with me. I really hope you enjoyed the video and that you found it helpful. If you need more help or more information, don't ever be shy to use the contact link, which is also down below, to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you, point you in the right direction with tools, advice, whatever it may be. So whether you're a seasoned vet that may have forgot how to do some of these things because it's just been a while, or you're a beginner, don't ever be shy. Having said that, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Be sure to share this video with a friend if you found it helpful. Many more mXrevival dirt bike tips and tricks in this playlist right here. And until next time, you guys, shred safe, and I will talk to you soon.